The corridor stretched endlessly before him, fluorescent lights humming overhead like interrogation room static. Private First Class James Harris pressed his back against the cold concrete wall, his cook's apron still damp with dishwater, his heart hammering so hard he was certain it would give him away. Every shadow was a threat. Every footstep in the distance made his breath catch. He'd been in this building, deep in enemy headquarters, for 6 days now. 6 days of chopping vegetables, scrubbing pots, keeping his head down. 6 days of being invisible. And now, in the span of 3 minutes, everything had changed. The thing he'd been sent here to do was done. The colonel was dead. And now every soldier in this compound would be hunting for the ghost who'd done it. Through the small window at the end of the hall, he could see the motor pool. Freedom was 300 yards and a lifetime away. Behind him, somewhere in the officer's wing, someone would find the body soon. Maybe they already had. Maybe the alarm would sound any second now, and this whole place would lock down like a prison. His hands trembled as he adjusted his apron, forcing himself to breathe slowly. In, out, in, out. You're just a cook. You're nobody. You're invisible. But he wasn't invisible. Not anymore. He was a man who'd just killed one of the most protected officers in the enemy's chain of command, right here in the heart of their operational headquarters. And if they caught him, they wouldn't just shoot him. They'd want to know everything: how he got in, who sent him, what else he knew. Harris closed his eyes for just a moment, remembering the briefing 6 weeks ago. The intelligence officer's voice had been matter-of-fact, clinical. Colonel Viktor Antonov, age 52, commands the 3rd Mechanized Division, responsible for the massacre at Riverside. 600 civilians, women, children. The officer had slid a photograph across the table. Harris remembered staring at it Antonov's cold eyes, his thin smile. "We need him gone," the officer had said. "And we need it to look like we were never there." Now, standing in this hallway with his heart trying to beat its way out of his chest, Harris wondered if he'd ever make it home to tell anyone he'd succeeded. The distant sound of boots on tile snapped him back to the present. Multiple footsteps. Running. Coming closer. It was time to move. 6 weeks earlier. The briefing room was windowless, the kind of space where careers ended and secrets were buried. Harris sat across from Major Sarah Kovac, the woman who would change his life in ways he couldn't yet imagine. "You understand why we're asking you specifically?" Kovac's eyes were sharp, assessing. Not just any operator could do this. Harris nodded slowly. He'd been a cook for 8 years, first in civilian life, then in the Army after he enlisted. But cooking wasn't why he was sitting in this room. 6 months ago, he'd been reassigned to military intelligence after demonstrating an almost supernatural ability to blend in, to be forgotten, to become part of the background. In a world of warriors who wanted to stand out, Harris had perfected the art of disappearing. "You speak their language fluently," Kovac continued. "Your mother was from their region. You know the culture, the mannerisms, the food. Most importantly, you know how to be invisible." She pushed a dossier across the table. Harris opened it. The first page showed a sprawling military compound, rows of barracks, an administrative building, vehicle depots, a mess hall that could feed 500 men. "This is Forward Operating Base Krasnov, about 40 miles behind enemy lines. It's their regional command center. And this," she tapped a photograph of a stern-faced officer with steel-gray hair, "is Colonel Viktor Antonov." Harris had heard the name. Everyone had. Antonov was a butcher, a war criminal who'd ordered the shelling of civilian evacuation routes. The massacre at Riverside had made international news. 600 people killed in a single afternoon. The images had been horrific: bodies in the streets, a hospital reduced to rubble, children's toys scattered among the debris. "Why hasn't anyone gone after him before?" Harris asked. "Because he's smart. He stays behind the lines, surrounded by hundreds of soldiers. Heavy security, multiple checkpoints, armed guards at every entrance. We've tried 3 times to take him out with precision strikes, but he moves constantly. By the time we get intelligence on his location, he's already gone." Kovac leaned forward. "We need someone inside, someone who can get close without raising suspicion, someone who can do the job and get out before anyone realizes what happened. You want me to cook for them. I want you to become one of them. We've been preparing for this for months. We have documents, a cover story, everything you need. There's been a recent shakeup in their Kit Harris staff. 3 cooks were transferred to frontline units last week. They're desperate for experienced Kit Harris personnel. We've arranged for you to fill one of those positions. Harris stared at the photograph of Antonov. And once I'm in, you wait. You observe. You learn their routines, their security protocols, their blind spots. And when the moment is right, when you have access and opportunity, you eliminate the target. Make it look natural, if you can. An accident, a heart attack. If that's not possible, make it quick and quiet. Then disappear into the population of the base until the initial investigation passes. After that, we extract you. How? Kovacs smiled thinly. 1 step at a time, Harris. First, you have to get in. Then you have to do the job. Then we worry about getting you home. 3 weeks later, Harris found himself in the back of a supply truck, bouncing along a rutted road toward Fob Krasnov. His papers identified him as Dmitry Sokolov, a career military cook recently transferred from a garrison unit in the south. His backstory was solid, verifiable records, a service history, even a few minor disciplinary incidents to make him seem more human. The documents had been perfect. The checkpoint guards had barely glanced at them before waving the truck through. Harris had spent the entire journey rehearsing his cover story, his accent, his mannerisms. By the time he arrived at the compound, he'd buried David Harris so deep that even he almost believed he was Dmitry Sokolov. The Kit Harris was exactly what he'd expected: industrial, utilitarian, designed to feed hundreds of men efficiently rather than well. The head cook, a bear of a man named Yevgeny, had looked him up and down with undisguised skepticism. You know how to make borscht? 30 gallons at a time if you need it, Harris replied in flawless Russian. Pelmeni? By the 1,000, Yevgeny had grunted, apparently satisfied. You start tomorrow, 6 a.m. Don't be late. That was it. He was in. For the first 4 days, Harris did nothing but cook. He worked 14-hour shifts, preparing breakfast, lunch, and dinner for the hundreds of soldiers stationed at the base. He learned the rhythms of the Kit Harris when deliveries arrived, when the officers ate, which guards were strict and which were lazy. He also learned about Antonov. The colonel maintained a private dining room on the 2nd floor of the administrative building. He ate breakfast at 0700, lunch at 1300, and dinner at 1900 precisely, without deviation. His meals were prepared in the main Kit Harris, but delivered by a dedicated, orderly, a nervous young private named Alexei, who seemed terrified of his assignment. Harris watched Alexei carefully. The orderly would arrive at the Kit Harris at specific times, collect the colonel's meal on a covered tray, and disappear up the back stairs to the officer's wing. He always returned exactly 20 minutes later with empty dishes. The pattern was consistent, predictable, and predictability was a vulnerability. On the 5th day, Harris made his first move. He'd been assigned to prepare the officers' meals, a sign that Yevgeny trusted him, or at least didn't distrust him enough to keep him away from sensitive duties. As he worked on Antonov's lunch, a simple but well-prepared meal of roasted chicken, vegetables, and dark bread, he studied every detail of the preparation process. The meal was assembled on a specific tray, covered with a specific cloth. Alexei would arrive, inspect the tray briefly, then carry it upstairs. The whole transaction took less than 2 minutes. Harris needed to be that orderly. That evening, after his shift ended, he made his way to the barracks housing the administrative staff. Finding Alexei's bunk wasn't difficult. Everyone knew the nervous kid who served the colonel's meals. Harris waited until the early hours of the morning, then approached. Alexei? He shook the young soldier gently awake. Wake up. There's been a change. The private blinked groggily. What? What change? New security protocol. Officers' meals are being delivered by Kit Harris staff now, not orderlies. You're reassigned to motor pool duty starting today. Report to Sergeant Volkov at 6. Alexei sat up, confused. But nobody told me. I'm telling you now. Direct order from Captain Medvedev. Something about operational security. Don't ask me the details, I just cook. But if you're late to the motor pool, Volkov will have your ass. The young soldier nodded slowly, still half asleep. By the time he was fully awake and thought to question the order, Harris would have already established the new routine. And in a military compound where orders flowed constantly and confusion was endemic, one reassigned orderly wouldn't raise immediate suspicion. It was a risk, but it was a calculated one. The next morning, Harris prepared Antonov's breakfast with meticulous care. Everything had to be perfect, not just good, but exactly what the colonel expected. Any deviation might trigger suspicion. At 6:50, he arranged the meal on the tray. Soft-boiled eggs, toast with butter and jam, a small bowl of cottage cheese, black tea. He covered it with the white cloth and waited. When 6:55 came and Alexei didn't appear, Harris picked up the tray and walked calmly toward the back stairs. A guard at the bottom of the stairwell stopped him. "Where's Alexei?" "Reassigned," Harris said smoothly. "Motor pool." "I'm doing deliveries now." The guard frowned but didn't press the issue. He waved Harris through. The hallway on the second floor was quiet, carpeted, lined with office doors bearing brass nameplates. Harris walked slowly, counting doors, matching the layout to the blueprints he'd memorized during training. Antonov's private dining room was at the end of the hall, next to his office. He knocked twice. "Enter," came a clipped voice from inside. Harris opened the door. Colonel Viktor Antonov sat at a small table by the window, reading a report. He was smaller than Harris had imagined, not physically imposing, just an ordinary-looking man in his 50s, with thinning hair and reading glasses. But there was something in his posture, in the way he held himself, that radiated authority. "You're not Alexei," Antonov said without looking up. "No, sir." Alexei was reassigned. "I'll be delivering your meals from now on." Antonov set down the report and removed his glasses. His eyes were cold, analytical. "What's your name?" "Sokolov, sir. Kit Harris' staff." "How long have you been here, Sokolov?" 5 days, sir." Antonov studied him for a long moment. Harris kept his face neutral, his breathing steady. This was the moment, the first real test. If the colonel suspected anything, if Harris had made even the smallest mistake in his cover, it would end right here. Finally, Antonov gestured toward the table. "Put it down." Harris placed the tray carefully on the table, removed the cloth, and stepped back. "That will be all." Harris nodded and left, closing the door quietly behind him. In the hallway, he allowed himself one shallow breath of relief. He'd done it. He'd gotten into the room. He'd seen the target up close, and now he knew exactly what he needed to do. For 2 more days, Harris delivered Antonov's meals without incident. Each time, the routine was the same. Knock twice, enter, place the tray, leave. The colonel barely acknowledged him. To Antonov, Harris was just another faceless servant, beneath notice. Which was exactly what Harris needed. On the 8th day, Harris made his final preparations. During the lunch shift, he prepared Antonov's meal as usual. But this time, he added one extra element, a small vial of clear liquid that he'd carried into the compound, hidden in a false bottom of his cooking knife case. The liquid was odorless, tasteless, and lethal in the right dose. It would cause cardiac arrest within 15 to 20 minutes. Symptoms indistinguishable from a natural heart attack. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't cinematic, but it was effective, and more importantly, it was undetectable, without a sophisticated autopsy. The kind that wouldn't happen to a 52-year-old colonel with a history of high blood pressure and stress. Harris mixed the liquid into the gravy that accompanied Antonov's roasted pork. He covered the tray and carried it upstairs at precisely 1,255. Knock twice, enter, place the tray. Antonov was on a phone call. He waved Harris away without looking at him. Harris left the room and descended the stairs, his mind already racing through the next phase. He had 15 to 20 minutes before the effects would manifest. He needed to be visible during that time, seen by multiple people, establishing an alibi, creating witnesses who could place him in the Kit Harris. Far from the crime scene, he returned to the Kit Harris and immediately began prep work for dinner, making sure Yevgeny and the other cooks saw him working, heard him talking, noticed his presence. 18 minutes later, the alarm sounded. The administrative building erupted into chaos. Boots thundered in hallways. Voices shouted orders. The entire compound locked down within minutes, no one in, no one out. In the Kit Harris continued chopping vegetables as though nothing had happened. Around him, the other cooks exchanged nervous glances. "What's going on?" asked Ivan, one of the younger staff members. Yevgeny shook his head grimly. "Nothing good. Keep working." 20 minutes later, military police arrived in the Kit Harris. "Everyone stops what they're doing," commanded a hard-faced captain named Volkov. "No one leaves. No one talks. We'll call you one at a time." Harris felt his pulse quicken but kept his face neutral. This was expected. This was part of the plan. He'd known there would be an investigation. The MPs set up in a small office adjacent to the Kit Harris, a cramped space normally used for inventory management. One by one, they began calling in the Kit Harris staff. Harris continued working, but his mind was cataloging every detail of his movements that day. Where he'd been, who had seen him, what he'd said. Every answer had to be consistent, unremarkable, forgettable. The interviews took hours. By the time the dinner shift should have started, only half the staff had been questioned. The Kit Harris operated in tense silence, everyone aware that something catastrophic had happened, but no one quite sure what. Finally, late in the afternoon, Harris heard his name. "Sokolov, you're up." He set down his knife, wiped his hands on his apron, and walked into the office. Captain Volkov sat behind a small desk, flanked by another MP taking notes. The room smelled like stale coffee and stress. "Sit." Harris sat. Volkov studied a clipboard in front of him. "You're new here. 5 days?" 8 days, sir." "Right, 8 days. You've been delivering meals to Colonel Antonov." "Yes, sir." "Why you?" "The previous orderly was reassigned. I was available." "Whose decision was that?" "I believe it was Captain Medvedev's, sir. I was told to take over the duty." Volkov made a note. "You delivered the Colonel's lunch today at what time?" 1255, sir." "Same as always." "Describe exactly what happened." Harris kept his voice steady, matter of fact. "I prepared the meal according to the Colonel's preferences. Roasted pork, vegetables, gravy, bread. At 1255, I carried it upstairs to his dining room. I knocked twice, entered, and placed the tray on his table. The Colonel was on the phone. He waved me away. I left and returned to the Kit Harris." "How long were you in the room?" "Maybe 15 seconds. 20 at most." "Did you notice anything unusual? Anything out of place?" "No, sir. Everything seemed normal." "Did the Colonel eat any of the food while you were there?" "Not that I saw, sir." Volkov leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving Harris's face. "Colonel Antonov is dead, Sokolov. Died approximately 18 minutes after you delivered his meal. Heart attack, the medics say. Very sudden, very convenient timing." Harris felt his stomach tighten, but kept his expression neutral. "I'm sorry to hear that, sir." "Are you?" Volkov's voice was sharp. "Did you poison him?" "No, sir." "Did you tamper with his food in any way?" "No, sir." "Did anyone else have access to the meal before you delivered it?" "No, sir. I prepared it myself and carried it directly to the Colonel's room." "So if someone poisoned the Colonel's food, it would have had to be you." Harris met Volkov's gaze steadily. "If the Colonel was poisoned, sir, it wasn't by me. I prepared his meal the same way I've prepared it every day for the past week. The same way I've prepared meals for hundreds of soldiers in my 8 years of military service. I'm a cook. That's all I am." Volkov stared at him for a long moment, then glanced at his notes. "You're dismissed. Don't leave the compound." "Yes, sir." Harris stood and left the room, fighting the urge to walk too quickly, to show any sign of relief or nervousness. In the Kit Harris, he returned to his station and resumed working, aware of the curious glances from the other staff, but saying nothing. He'd passed the first interview, but he knew it was just the beginning. Over the next 2 days, the investigation intensified. The entire compound remained on lockdown. No one was allowed to leave, communications were restricted, and the military police interviewed everyone who'd been anywhere near the administrative building on the day of Antonov's death. Harris watched the process unfold with carefully hidden anxiety. Each new round of interviews brought more questions, more scrutiny, more chances for his cover to unravel. The MPs started with the obvious suspects, the cooks, the orderlies, anyone who'd had direct contact with Antonov. But as the investigation progressed and no clear evidence emerged, they widened their net. On the second day, Harris overheard two guards talking near the Kit Harris entrance. "They're bringing in investigators from military intelligence," one said. "This wasn't just a heart attack. They think someone killed him." "How?" "The autopsy didn't show anything. That's the problem. They can't prove it was murder, but they can't rule it out either. And the timing is too convenient. Right after lunch. Right after the new cook delivered his meal." Harris felt a chill run down his spine. They were close. Not close enough to arrest him, not yet, but close enough to be dangerous. That afternoon, he was called in for a second interview. This time, the interrogator was different, a colonel from military intelligence named Konstantin Petrov. He was older than Volkov, with gray hair and the kind of calm demeanor that came from years of extracting information from people who didn't want to give it. "Sit down, Sokolov," Petrov said pleasantly. "This won't take long." Harris sat. Petrov opened a folder and began reading, as if reviewing information he already knew. "You've had an interesting career. 8 years as a military cook, no disciplinary problems beyond a few minor infractions. Steady performance reviews. You were stationed in the South before this, correct?" "Yes, sir." "And you requested the transfer here?" "I didn't request it, sir. I was assigned." "Ah, yes. Part of a general reshuffling after 3 of the cooks here were sent to frontline units." Petrov looked up. "Convenient timing. I wouldn't know about that, sir." "No, I suppose you wouldn't." Petrov smiled. "Tell me, Sokolov, why do you think Colonel Antonov died?" "I have no idea, sir. I'm not a doctor. But you prepared his last meal. You were alone with him, however briefly. Surely you must have some thoughts." "I assume it was his heart, sir. That's what the medics said." "Yes, that's what they said. But between you and me," Petrov leaned forward conspiratorially, "I'm not convinced. Colonel Antonov was in good health. He exercised regularly. Didn't smoke. His last physical examination showed no significant cardiac issues. And then suddenly, he drops dead 18 minutes after eating lunch." "What do you make of that?" Harris shrugged. "People die unexpectedly sometimes, sir. Even healthy people." "True. Very true." Petrov sat back. "But you understand why we have to investigate thoroughly. A colonel doesn't die under mysterious circumstances without someone asking questions." "Of course, sir. So let's go through it again. You prepared the meal yourself?" "Yes, sir." "No one else touched it?" "Not that I'm aware of, sir." "And you carried it directly to the colonel's dining room?" "Yes, sir." "Did you stop anywhere along the way? Talk to anyone?" "No, sir. I went straight from the Kit Harris to his room." Petrov made a note. "The guard at the stairs says you arrived at 1255. The colonel was found dead at 1318. That's 23 minutes. Does that timeline match your recollection?" "I didn't check my watch, sir, but that sounds about right." "And you returned to the Kit Harris immediately after delivering the meal?" "Yes, sir." "Who saw you?" Harris recited the names of the cooks who'd been in the Kit Harris at that time: Yevgeny, Ivan, Mikhail, and 2 others. "We were preparing dinner, sir. Multiple people can verify I was there." Petrov nodded slowly. "Yes, they have. Everyone confirms you were in the Kit Harris by 1300, which means you had, at most, 5 minutes between leaving the colonel's room and being seen back in the Kit Harris." "I walked quickly, sir. I had work to do." "I'm sure you did." Petrov closed the folder. "You're dismissed for now, Sokolov, but don't go far. I suspect we'll be talking again soon." On the third day, the investigation took a darker turn. Harris arrived for his morning shift to find military police searching the kit. Harris going through supplies, checking storage areas, examining every piece of equipment. They were looking for evidence, anything that might prove poisoning. Yevgeny stood to the side, arms crossed, watching with barely concealed fury. "This is ridiculous," he muttered to Harris. "We've done nothing wrong." "This is harassment." Harris said nothing. He knew what they'd find. Nothing. The vial had been disposed of the night of the assassination, dropped down a latrine shaft, where it would never be recovered. His cooking knives had been thoroughly cleaned. There was no evidence to find, but the search itself was a message. We're watching you. We know someone here is responsible. That afternoon, Petrov called Harris in for a third interview. This time, the colonel's demeanor was less pleasant. "We have a problem, Sokolov," Petrov said, without preamble. "Your story doesn't quite add up." Harris felt his pulse quicken but kept his face neutral. "Sir, several witnesses place you on the second floor at 1255 when you delivered the colonel's meal. But two soldiers, Private Orlov and Corporal Dankin, say they saw you in the east corridor near the supply room at approximately 13:02. That's 7 minutes after you claimed to have delivered the meal and returned to the Kit Harris." Harris's mind raced. He'd been careful, so careful. He'd gone straight from Antonov's room to the Kit Harris. He hadn't stopped. He hadn't. Wait. He'd passed two soldiers in the hallway on his way to the stairs. They'd been carrying boxes. He'd nodded to them but hadn't spoken. They must have remembered him. Placed him in the hallway at that time. "Sir, I did pass two soldiers in the hallway," Harris said carefully, "but it was on my way to deliver the meal, not after. I must have passed them at around 1253 or 1254, just before I knocked on the colonel's door. They say it was after 1300. With respect, sir, they must be mistaken about the time. I was back in the Kit Harris by 1300. Multiple witnesses can confirm that." Petrov leaned back, studying Harris with cold eyes. "You see my problem. Two soldiers say one thing. 5 cooks say another. Someone is wrong, or someone is lying." "I'm not lying, sir." "Maybe not. But someone is." Petrov stood abruptly. "I'm going to figure out what happened, Sokolov. And if you had anything to do with Colonel Antonov's death, I will find out. Do you understand me?" "Yes, sir." Dismissed. Harris left the office with his heart pounding. They were getting closer. Not because they had evidence they didn't, but because they were systematically eliminating possibilities, narrowing the pool of suspects, and every conversation, every interview, was another chance for a contradiction, a mistake, a slip that would give him away. He had to get out. Soon, on the 4th day, the investigation reached its climax. Harris was in the Kit Harris when he heard raised voices from the administrative building. Through the window, he could see military police moving with renewed purpose, their body language suggesting they'd found something important. An hour later, Yevgeny was called away for questioning. He returned 40 minutes later looking shaken. "They're interviewing everyone again," he told the Kit Harris staff. "They found something. I don't know what, but they think they know who did it." Harris felt his blood run cold. He continued working, but his mind was screaming at him to run, to move, to get out now before they came for him. That evening, after his shift ended, Harris made his way casually to the latrine, a communal building at the edge of the compound. Inside, he locked himself in a stall and allowed himself a moment to think. They'd found something. But what? He'd been so careful. There was no evidence, no witnesses, no proof. Unless someone knocked on the latrine door. "Sokolov? You in there?" Harris recognized Petrov's voice. His stomach dropped. "Yes, sir. One moment." He flushed, washed his hands, and opened the door. Petrov stood outside with 2 MPs. His expression was grim. "We need to talk. Come with us." "Sir, Now, Sokolov." Harris followed them across the compound to the administrative building. But instead of going to the interview office, they led him to a conference room on the 1st floor. Inside, a dozen officers sat around a large table, including the base commander, Colonel Ivanov. Petrov gestured to an empty chair. "Sit down." Harris sat, his mind racing through possible scenarios. This was it. They'd figured it out. They were going to arrest him, interrogate him, execute him. Colonel Ivanov leaned forward. "Private Sokolov, we've completed our investigation into the death of Colonel Antonov. We know who killed him." Harris said nothing. "It was you." The room was silent. Harris met Ivanov's gaze. "Sir?" I didn't. Don't. Ivanov's voice was steel. We've reviewed all the evidence. We've interviewed every witness. We've examined the timelines, the access records, the opportunities, and everything points to you. Petrov opened a folder. You were new to this base. You took over meal delivery duties under suspicious circumstances. You were alone with Colonel Antonov at the exact time he would have ingested a lethal substance. You had the means, the opportunity, and most tellingly, you had several small inconsistencies in your story that accumulated over multiple interviews. But you have no physical evidence, Harris said quietly. No, Petrov admitted. We don't. No poison was found, no murder weapon, no proof beyond circumstantial evidence. Which is why, he closed the folder, we can't officially charge you with murder, but we can detain you as a suspect, pending further investigation. Colonel Ivanov stood. Private Sokolov, you are hereby confined to the detention barracks until we can transfer you to Military Intelligence Headquarters for enhanced interrogation. You will be... The lights went out. For 3 seconds, the room was pitch black. Harris heard confused voices, the scrape of chairs, someone cursing. Then the emergency lighting kicked in dim red bulbs that cast everything in a crimson glow. Power failure, someone said. The backup generator should... An explosion rattled the building. Not close, but not far, somewhere near the motor pool. Chaos erupted. Officers shouted orders. The MPs moved toward the door, hands on their sidearms, and Harris, in that moment of confusion, made his decision. He was out of time. It was time to disappear. Harris moved fast. While the officers scrambled to respond to the explosion, he slipped out of the conference room and into the darkened hallway. The emergency lighting cast long shadows, turning familiar corridors into an alien landscape. He had to assume the explosion was just a coincidence, a transformer failure, or an accident in the motor pool. His extraction team wouldn't move until he gave the signal, and he hadn't given it, which meant this was an unexpected opportunity. Nothing more. He couldn't go back to the barracks. The MPs would be looking for him there within minutes. He couldn't go to the Kit Harris, too obvious. He needed to disappear completely, to become someone else, to blend into the chaos. Harris ducked into a supply closet and quickly stripped off his cook's apron and jacket. Underneath, he wore a plain green undershirt, standard issue for dozens of roles on the base. He grabbed a maintenance coverall from a hook on the wall and pulled it on over his clothes. In the dim lighting, he could pass for a mechanic or technician responding to the emergency. The coverall had a name patch. Volkov. Not the captain, a different Volkov. Someone in maintenance. Harris tore it off and stuffed it in his pocket. Better to have no name than the wrong name. He emerged from the closet and immediately encountered a group of soldiers running toward the motor pool. He fell in step with them, matching their pace, his expression appropriately concerned. What happened? He asked one of them. Don't know. Some kind of explosion. Could be sabotage. Sabotage. The word sent a chill through Harris. If they thought this was an enemy attack, the compound would go into full lockdown. Every building would be searched. Every person accounted for. His window of opportunity was measured in minutes, not hours. They reached the motor pool to find controlled chaos. A fuel tank had ruptured, spilling diesel across the concrete. Soldiers with fire extinguishers were coating everything in white foam. Officers shouted orders. It looked like an accident, but in the current climate of paranoia, everyone was treating it as a potential attack. Harris hung back at the edge of the crowd, observing, calculating. The main gate was on the opposite side of the compound, at least 400 yards away through multiple checkpoints. Impossible to reach without being questioned, detained, searched. But there was another way out. During his 8 days on the base, Harris had noticed that the perimeter fence was patrolled by soldiers on foot, walking regular routes every 30 minutes. Between patrols, certain sections of the fence were unwatched, and there was one section, near the waste disposal area, where the fence ran close to a drainage ditch, close enough that someone could climb over and drop into the ditch without being seen from the guard towers. It was a slim chance, but it was the only chance he had. Harris slipped away from the motor pool crowd and made his way toward the southern edge of the compound. He moved with purpose but not haste, nodding to soldiers he passed, keeping his body language confident. Just another technician, responding to the emergency, doing his job. The waste disposal area was deserted. Harris checked his watch, 22:17. The last patrol would have passed here around 22. The next would come through at 22:30. That gave him 13 minutes. He crouched behind a dumpster and studied the fence. Chain link, 10 feet high, topped with 3 strands of barbed wire. Not designed to keep out a determined enemy army, just to mark the perimeter and deter casual desertion. Harris pulled off his coverall and wrapped it around his hands for protection. Then he grabbed the fence and started climbing. The chain link rattled softly under his weight. He froze, listening. No shouts, no alarms. He continued upward, moving slowly, testing each handhold. At the top, he used the coverall to press down the barbed wire, creating a small gap he could squeeze through. The wire still caught his sleeve, tearing the fabric and scraping his arm, but he ignored the pain and pushed through. He dropped into the drainage ditch on the other side, landing hard in ankle-deep water. For a moment, he just crouched there, breathing hard, listening for any sign that he'd been spotted. Nothing. Just the distant sounds of the ongoing chaos at the motor pool. Harris allowed himself a thin smile. He was outside the fence, but he was still within visual range of the guard towers, still on enemy territory, still hunted. The real escape was just beginning. The drainage ditch ran east for about half a mile before emptying into a larger stream. Harris followed it, moving in a low crouch, using the darkness and the depression in the ground to stay below the sight lines of the guard towers. His feet splashed through cold water. His torn sleeve leaked blood, but he kept moving. Behind him, he heard sirens. Searchlights swept the compound. They'd discovered his absence. Within minutes, they'd organize search parties, send soldiers to comb the perimeter, maybe even deploy dogs. He had to put distance between himself and the base, fast. After 20 minutes of hard movement through the ditch, Harris reached the stream. It was wider, deeper, running through a culvert under a rural road. He waded into the water up to his chest, using the current to help carry him downstream, away from the base. The water was bitterly cold, numbing his legs, making each step a struggle. But it would also mask his scent from any tracking dogs, wash away any trace evidence, make him harder to follow. He stayed in the water for nearly an hour, following the stream as it wound through farmland and scrub forest. By the time he finally crawled out onto a muddy bank, he was shaking uncontrollably from cold and exhaustion. Harris stripped off his soaked clothes and buried them in the mud. From a waterproof pouch he'd kept strapped to his chest, one of the few pieces of equipment he'd smuggled into the compound, he pulled out civilian clothes, a compass, false identification papers, and a small amount of local currency. The plan from this point was simple. Reach the extraction point, 40 miles southwest of the base. His handlers would be waiting there in 3 days. All he had to do was survive until then. Harris moved through the countryside like a ghost, traveling only at night, sleeping during the day in barns, abandoned buildings, or dense thickets. He avoided roads, villages, anything that might have military checkpoints or curious civilians who might remember a stranger passing through. On the second day, he heard helicopters, distant but persistent, combing the area in a systematic search pattern. They were looking for him. The enemy had mobilized significant resources to find Colonel Antonov's killer. Harris buried himself under a pile of hay in an old barn and waited for the helicopters to pass. He could hear them circling, their rotors beating the air, so close he could feel the vibration in his chest. But they didn't spot him. After an hour, they moved on. That night, he risked approaching a small farm to steal food. He waited until the family inside had gone to bed, then crept into their storage shed and took bread, cheese, and a bottle of water. He left money behind, not from any sense of honor, but because unexplained theft might trigger a report to local authorities, might bring more attention to the area. On the third day, exhausted and running on fumes, Harris reached the extraction point, an abandoned quarry 20 miles from the nearest settlement. He found a sheltered position with good sight lines and settled in to wait. His extraction team was supposed to arrive between midnight and 0200. Harris checked his watch. 1845. Still hours to go. He used the time to rest, to eat the last of his stolen food, to mentally prepare for what would come next. If his team didn't show up, if something had gone wrong, if they'd been compromised, he'd have to make his way to the border on foot. Another 100 miles through enemy territory with no supplies, no support, no backup plan. But he tried not to think about that. He'd come this far. He'd completed his mission. Antonov was dead. All he had to do was get home. At 1:17, Harris heard the sound of an engine, low, distant, approaching slowly. He crouched behind a boulder and watched as a civilian truck appeared on the dirt road leading to the quarry. It stopped at the edge of the abandoned site. The headlights flashed twice, then went dark. The signal. Harris emerged from cover and approached cautiously. The driver's door opened and a woman stepped out, Major Sarah Kovac, the intelligence officer who'd briefed him weeks ago. "Harris," she said quietly, "good to see you're still breathing." "Good to be breathing." Harris climbed into the back of the truck, where 2 other operators sat with weapons ready. They nodded to him but said nothing. Kovac got back in the driver's seat and started the engine. "We're taking you to a safe house about 60 miles from here. You'll stay there for a few days while we arrange transport across the border. After that, you'll be debriefed at headquarters." "Did anyone follow you?" Harris asked. "No, but the whole region is crawling with their military. They're looking for you hard. Every checkpoint, every patrol, every village. They know someone killed Antonov. They just don't know who." "Did it work?" Harris asked. "Did we get what we needed?" Kovac glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "Antonov's death has caused chaos in their command structure. The 3rd Mechanized Division is paralyzed. They've pulled back from 3 offensive positions while they figure out who's in charge. It's bought us time. Maybe weeks. Maybe more." Harris leaned back against the truck's metal wall, feeling the exhaustion finally catch up with him. "Good." They drove in silence for a while, the truck bouncing along rural roads, winding through the darkness. Harris watched the landscape pass by, farmland, forests, small villages sleeping peacefully, unaware of the war being fought around them. After an hour, Kovac spoke again. "You did well, Harris. Better than well. The brass is impressed. They're talking about medals, commendations, promotions." "I just want to go home," Harris said quietly. "You will. Soon." 10 days later, David Harris sat in a debriefing room at Military Intelligence Headquarters, telling his story for the 5th time. The officers listened intently, asking questions, making notes, trying to extract every detail of his infiltration, his assassination, his escape. "When you realized they'd identified you as a suspect," one officer asked, "why didn't you give the extraction signal immediately?" "I didn't have time," Harris explained, "and I didn't want to risk compromising the extraction team by calling them in prematurely. The power failure gave me an unexpected opportunity. I took it. The power failure was fortunate." "Yes, sir. Very fortunate." The officer made a note. Harris didn't mention that he'd spent the entire previous day studying the base's electrical system, noting which transformer controlled which building, calculating how to create a disruption if he needed a diversion. The power failure might have looked like an accident, but Harris had planted the seeds for it days earlier, a small piece of metal wedged into a junction box, ready to cause a short circuit under the right conditions. But that detail would remain his secret. Some things didn't need to be in the official record. After the debriefing, Harris was released. No medals, no ceremony. His role in Antonov's death would remain classified for decades. But there was a promotion, a generous bonus, and a week of leave. He spent that week in a quiet cabin in the mountains, far from the war, far from the constant stress and fear. He slept 12 hours a night. He cooked meals for himself, simple food, nothing elaborate, just the act of preparing something that wouldn't poison anyone. He tried to forget the look in Antonov's eyes when he'd placed that final tray on the table, the cold calculation in the colonel's voice. He tried to forget a lot of things. Colonel Petrov stood in what had once been Viktor Antonov's office, reviewing the case file one more time. The investigation had officially been closed, marked as an unexplained death, possibly cardiac arrest, possibly poisoning, but with insufficient evidence to determine cause or suspect. But Petrov knew. He'd known from the beginning. That cook Sokolov, or whatever his real name was, had done it. The timing, the opportunity, the small inconsistencies in his story. And then his disappearance during the power failure, his escape over the fence, his vanishing into the countryside like smoke. It had been a professional operation, probably military intelligence, possibly special operations. Someone had sent an assassin deep into their headquarters, and that assassin had killed one of their most important commanders right under their noses. The thought made Petrov furious, but it also made him respect the enemy's capabilities. Whoever had planned this operation had been brilliant. Whoever had executed it had been even better. "Colonel?" An aide appeared in the doorway. "You asked to be notified when we received the final report from the forensics team. And they found nothing. No trace of poison in the body. No foreign substances in the food samples we preserved. Colonel Antonov's death remains officially listed as cardiac arrest." Petrov nodded slowly. "Thank you. That will be all." After the aide left, Petrov walked to the window and looked out over the compound. Life had returned to normal, soldiers drilling, vehicles moving, the Kit Harris preparing meals for hundreds of men. Everything looked the same as it had before Antonov's death. But it wasn't the same. Everyone knew now that they were vulnerable, that their security could be breached, that an enemy could walk among them, invisible, and strike without warning. Somewhere out there, the man who'd killed Antonov was alive, free, probably being celebrated as a hero by his own people. Petrov would never know his real name, would never see his face again, would never get the chance to catch him and make him pay for what he'd done. It was infuriating, and it was a lesson Petrov would never forget. He turned from the window and picked up the case file. For a moment, he considered keeping it open, continuing the investigation, pursuing every lead no matter how cold. Then he placed it in his desk drawer and locked it. Some mysteries would never be solved. Some ghosts would never be caught. And somewhere in enemy territory, a cook who wasn't really a cook had gotten away with the perfect assassination. Private First Class David Harris, promoted to specialist for reasons that would remain forever classified, stood in the Kit Harris of his new unit, preparing dinner for 200 soldiers. He chopped vegetables with practiced efficiency, his hands moving with the muscle memory of years of experience. Around him, other cooks worked and joked and complained about the heat. None of them knew what Harris had done. None of them knew that the quiet specialist who rarely talked about his past had carried out one of the most daring assassinations of the war. And that was exactly how Harris wanted it. Occasionally, late at night when he couldn't sleep, he'd think about those 8 days at FOB Krasnov. He'd remember the constant fear, the weight of carrying a secret that could get him killed, the moment when he'd placed that poisoned meal in front of Colonel Antonov and walked away. He didn't regret it. Antonov had been responsible for the deaths of 600 civilians. He'd ordered the shelling of hospitals and schools. He'd earned what had happened to him. But Harris also knew he'd crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. He'd killed a man in cold blood, had looked him in the eye and condemned him to death. It was justified. It was necessary. But it had changed something fundamental in Harris's soul. He was no longer just a cook. He was a weapon, a tool that could be pointed at an enemy and trusted to do what needed to be done, regardless of the cost. And somewhere in a file cabinet at Military Intelligence Headquarters, there was a folder with his name on it, a folder that would be pulled out the next time they needed someone to disappear into enemy territory and eliminate a target. Harris knew he'd be called again. There would be another mission, another target, another compound where he'd have to become invisible and strike from the shadows. But for now, he was just a cook, just a specialist preparing dinner for his unit, just another soldier in an army full of soldiers. And when someone asked him where he'd been stationed before this assignment, he'd smile and say, "Just a garrison unit down south. Nothing interesting. Pretty boring, actually." And they'd believe him, because that's what people did. They believed the story you told them, the role you played, the person you pretended to be. Harris had learned that lesson well. He'd become a ghost once. And if his country needed him to, he'd become a ghost again. But tonight, he was just a cook. And that was enough. The legend of the assassination at FOB Krasnov would spread quietly through the intelligence community over the years. Never officially confirmed, never fully documented, but whispered about in secure briefing rooms and classified reports. They called him the Ghost in the Kit Harris, the operative who'd infiltrated an enemy headquarters, killed a high-value target, and escaped without leaving a trace. His methods became the subject of case studies. His infiltration techniques were analyzed and replicated. His ability to blend in, to become invisible, to execute a mission under impossible circumstances became the gold standard for covert operations. But his name remained classified. His face remained unknown. Even within the intelligence community, only a handful of people knew who he really was. And David Harris, now serving out his time in a quiet posting far from the front lines, was perfectly content with that anonymity. He'd had his moment of glory, his brush with legend. He'd proven that sometimes the most dangerous weapon wasn't a gun or a bomb or a missile strike. Sometimes it was just a cook with a tray of food and the courage to walk into the heart of enemy territory. Sometimes the most lethal operators were the ones nobody noticed at all. And somewhere in the ruins of FOB Krasnov abandoned now, after the enemy pulled back from that entire region, there was still a Kit Harris where Harris had worked for 8 days, still a staircase he'd climbed carrying poisoned meals, still a dining room where a colonel had eaten his last lunch, never knowing that the quiet cook who'd served him was his executioner. The compound had been thoroughly searched after Antonov's death. They'd found nothing, no evidence, no clues, no explanation for how their security had been so thoroughly compromised. Because Harris had been that good, he'd been a ghost. And ghosts don't leave evidence behind.